The scorching summer sun beat down mercilessly on the arid plains of Texas, as Deanna Wilson's wagon wheel snapped clean off, stranding her miles from the nearest town with nothing but the vast, unforgiving landscape stretching in every direction. It was 1875, and the 22-year-old schoolteacher from Boston had embarked on what she had romantically termed her Western adventure, never anticipating that it would nearly cost her life. Deanna wiped the sweat from her brow, her vision already swimming from the heat. She had been traveling for 3 days since leaving the last settlement, heading toward her new position in Copper Creek. The school board had hired her based on letters of recommendation alone, desperate for someone educated enough to teach their children. Now, as she stumbled around the broken wagon, she wondered if she would ever reach her destination. "Come on, Maple," she coaxed her exhausted mare, who stood with head lowered beneath the punishing sun. "We need to find shelter before nightfall." Gathering only what she could carry, a small satchel of clothes, her teaching materials, a canteen of water already half empty, and a few provisions, Deanna set out on foot, leading Maple by the reins. The terrain was treacherous, scattered with rocks and thorny brush that tore at her skirts. Her delicate Eastern boots, so fashionable in Boston, were wholly inadequate for this harsh landscape. By sundown, Deanna's water was gone. Her lips had cracked from dehydration, and the beginnings of fever flushed her skin with unnatural heat. When she stumbled upon an abandoned line shack tucked against a rocky outcropping, she nearly wept with relief. The shack was little more than 4 walls and a roof, with a small fireplace and a rickety cot in one corner. Dust covered every surface and small creatures scurried into crevices as she entered, but it was shelter. Deanna tethered Maple outside near a small patch of grass, promising to find water for them both in the morning. That night, as temperatures plummeted in the desert fashion, Deanna shivered violently on the cot, her body alternating between burning heat and icy chills. Her head throbbed, and her throat felt like she had swallowed sand. With no medicine and no water, she drifted in and out of consciousness, delirious dreams mixing with frightening reality. "Mother," she whispered into the darkness, "I don't think I made it after all." Miles away, Vaughn Lockhart was returning to his small ranch after delivering cattle to the railroad. At 30 years old, he had carved out a modest but respectable living, unlike many who had come west with grand dreams only to find hardship. His ranch, the Double L, was nothing compared to the vast cattle empires of some, but it was his, bought and paid for with 6 years of backbreaking work. Vaughn's foreman, Henry Wilkes, rode alongside him. The older man had been with him since the beginning, teaching him the ways of cattle ranching when Vaughn had been nothing but a greenhorn with callous free hands and Eastern notions. "Storm's coming," Henry noted, nodding toward the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "Going to be a bad one by the look of it," Vaughn frowned beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. "We'd better check the line shacks, make sure they're secure. I'll take the south route, you head north." They parted ways at the fork in the trail, Vaughn turning his horse toward the most remote of his property's boundaries. The wind picked up as he rode, carrying with it the distinct smell of rain, a rarity in these parts and usually cause for celebration. But the darkening sky promised not gentle relief but violent deluge. As Vaughn approached the southernmost line shack, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A horse was tethered outside, its ribs showing through its hide, head hanging low from exhaustion. Vaughn dismounted cautiously, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Rustlers and outlaws weren't uncommon in these parts, and line shacks made convenient hideouts. "Hello, the house," he called out in the traditional greeting. "Anyone inside?" When no answer came, he approached more carefully, pushing the weather-beaten door open with the barrel of his gun. The sight that greeted him was not what he expected. A young woman lay on the cot, her face flushed an alarming red against pallid skin, her breathing shallow and labored. Her clothes, clearly Eastern in origin and wholly unsuited for the territory, were dusty and torn. Vaughn holstered his gun immediately and crossed to her side. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, revealing fever-bright blue irises that struggled to focus on his face. Water, she whispered, her voice a painful rasp. He reached for his canteen, lifting her head gently to help her drink. She managed only a few sips before collapsing back against the thin mattress. "I'll get you help," Vaughn promised, though he knew his ranch was hours away and the coming storm would make travel dangerous. "What's your name, Deanna?" she murmured. "Deanna Wilson." "I'm Vaughn Lockhart. This is my land you're on, Miss Wilson." A ghost of a smile touched her cracked lips. "Am I trespassing, Mr. Lockhart?" Despite the dire situation, Vaughn found himself smiling back. "Under the circumstances, I think we can overlook it." He worked quickly, building a fire in the small hearth to ward off the chill that would come with the rain. From his saddlebags, he retrieved jerky and hardtack, poor fare for someone ill, but better than nothing. He brought in the exhausted horse, unsaddling and brushing her down before giving her water and the last of his oats. When he had done all he could to make the shack habitable, Vaughn turned his attention back to Deanna. Her fever was climbing. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin without even touching her. Having lived in the territory for years, he recognized the signs of sun sickness complicated by dehydration. "Miss Wilson," he said softly, "I need to get your fever down. The storm's almost here and we can't travel until it passes." She nodded weakly, past the point of modesty or protest. Vaughn carefully removed her outer clothing, leaving her in her chemise to preserve her dignity. He soaked his bandana in water and placed it on her forehead, then covered her with his own blanket, much cleaner than the dusty one on the cot. As the first drops of rain began to pelt the roof, Vaughn sat beside her, feeling oddly protective of this stranger who had appeared so unexpectedly in his life. He had seen men and women die from fever in this unforgiving land, had buried friends who succumbed to illness far from home and kin. "Please," Deanna murmured, her eyes opening to fix on him with surprising lucidity. "Please don't let me die here." Vaughn took her burning hand in his calloused one. "You won't die, Miss Wilson. I won't allow it." As thunder crashed outside and rain pounded against the thin walls, Vaughn did something he hadn't done since leaving his mother's house in Missouri years ago. He bowed his head and prayed. "Lord," he said quietly, "I don't talk to you much these days, and I reckon that's my failing. But this woman needs your help more than my pride needs saving. She's sick, and I don't have medicine. I don't have much of anything except this shack and the will to see her through. So if you're listening, I'd appreciate a hand here." Deanna's fingers tightened around his as he spoke, whether from consciousness or reflex, he couldn't tell. But he continued to sit there beside her, changing the damp cloth on her forehead whenever it grew too warm, helping her sip water when she stirred, and praying silently as the night wore on and the storm raged around them. By morning, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind mud and swollen creek beds that would make travel difficult but not impossible. Vaughn had dozed fitfully in a chair beside the cot, waking at each sound Deanna made. When sunlight filtered through the single dirty window, he opened his eyes to find her watching him, her gaze clearer than it had been the previous day. "You stayed," she said softly. Vaughn straightened, wincing at the stiffness in his back from the uncomfortable chair. "Course I did. Couldn't very well leave you alone. My fever broke during the night." He reached out, touching her forehead with the back of his hand. The burning heat had indeed subsided, though she still felt warmer than normal. "That's good, real good, but you're still weak and we've got a ride ahead of us." Deanna tried to sit up but fell back with a grimace. "Where are we going?" "My ranch. It's about 4 hours' ride from here. I've got a proper house with a spare room, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, makes a mean chicken soup that'll have you back on your feet in no time." She looked uncertain. "I should continue to Copper Creek. They're expecting their new schoolteacher by the end of the week." Vaughn raised an eyebrow. "Copper Creek? That's another day's ride beyond my place, and you're in no condition to travel that far yet. Besides, I know Sheriff Mills there. I can get word to them about your delay." "You've already done so much," Deanna protested weakly. "I couldn't impose further. Miss Wilson out here helping folks in need isn't an imposition, it's survival." He stood, stretching his tall frame. "Now, do you think you can manage some breakfast before we head out? It's nothing fancy, just coffee and more hardtack softened in the pan. Despite her initial reluctance, Deanna accepted both the food and his assistance. As she ate, Vaughn explained his plan to have her ride with him on his horse while he would lead her mare behind them. "Your wagon," he said. "We'll send men back for it once you're settled. Where did you leave it?" "About 5 miles east of here, I think." Near a stand of cottonwoods by a dry creek bed, Vaughn nodded. "I know the place. We'll find it." When it was time to depart, he helped her dress, turning his back to allow her privacy but staying close enough to assist when her strength faltered. The simple act of pulling on her boots left her breathless and sweating. "This is humiliating," she murmured as he helped her to her feet. "In Boston, I was considered quite capable." Vaughn's lips twitched with amusement. "I don't doubt it, Miss Wilson, but Boston isn't the Texas territory. Even the most capable folks need help out here sometimes." Outside, he lifted her onto his horse as easily as if she weighed nothing, then mounted behind her. With one arm securely around her waist, he took the reins with his free hand. "Lean back against me if you need to," he told her. "It's a long ride." For the first hour, Deanna sat rigidly upright, clearly uncomfortable with their proximity. But as the journey continued, her strength waned, and eventually she relaxed against his chest, her head resting against his shoulder. Vaughn found himself intensely aware of her in a way that surprised him. It had been a long time since he'd been this close to a woman, especially one as refined and educated as she clearly was. Her hair, despite its current disheveled state, smelled faintly of lavender, and the trust implicit in the way she rested against him stirred something protective in his chest. "Tell me about your ranch," she said after a long silence, her voice stronger than before. Vaughn was happy to oblige, describing the modest but solid house he had built, the small herd of cattle he had carefully bred for hardiness in the harsh climate, and the dreams he had for expanding one day. "It's not much compared to some," he admitted, "but every acre is paid for and the beef we produce is good quality. We're starting to make a name for ourselves with the buyers in Kansas City." "You sound proud of it," Deanna observed. "I am. I came out here with nothing but the clothes on my back and a stubborn notion that I could make something of myself away from my father's shadow. There were plenty of times I nearly gave up, but..." He trailed off, realizing he was sharing more than he normally would with a stranger. "But what?" she prompted. Vaughn sighed. "But I'm too darn stubborn to admit defeat. My father said I'd come crawling back within a year. It's been 7 and I'm still here." "What does your father do?" "He's a banker in St. Louis. Wanted me to follow in his footsteps, wear a suit, marry the daughter of one of his business associates. I had other ideas." Deanna was quiet for a moment. "My father wanted me to marry the son of his law partner. He was perfectly suitable in every way except that I didn't love him. When I saw the advertisement for a schoolteacher in Copper Creek, it seemed like providence." "And now, still feeling providential?" Vaughn couldn't help asking, aware of the irony in her current situation. To his surprise, she laughed softly. "Ask me again when I'm not half dead from fever and being carried across the wilderness by a stranger." The sound of her laughter, unexpected and genuine, warmed him more than he cared to admit. By midday, they stopped briefly at a small stream to water the horses and rest. Deanna was visibly exhausted, her face pale beneath the lingering flush of fever. Vaughn helped her down and settled her in the shade of a large oak, then brought her water and the last of his provisions. "We're making good time," he assured her as she ate. "Another 2 hours and we'll be home." "Home," she echoed, the words sounding wistful on her lips. "I haven't had one of those in a while." Vaughn wanted to ask what she meant by that, but something in her expression held him back. Instead, he busied himself checking the horses and scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble. The territory had been relatively peaceful in recent months, but he had learned never to take safety for granted. When they resumed their journey, Deanna seemed more comfortable with their arrangement, settling against him without the earlier hesitation. She asked questions about the land they passed through, listening intently as he described the flora, fauna, and hidden water sources that the untrained eye might miss. "How do you know so much about all this?" she asked after he pointed out a particular plant that was good for treating burns. Had to learn fast when I got here. Henry, that's my foreman, taught me a lot. So did the local Comanche before most of them were moved to reservations. Knowledge means survival out here. Do you miss the city at all? Vaughn considered the question. Sometimes. I miss libraries and hot baths that don't require hauling water, but I don't miss the noise or the way people live on top of each other. Out here, a man can breathe. And a woman? Deanna asked, a challenge in her voice despite her weakness. He chuckled. Reckon that's for you to decide, Miss Wilson. As they crested a small rise, the Double L Ranch came into view, a modest but well-maintained house with a barn, bunkhouse, and several corrals spread out around it. Cattle dotted the hillsides beyond, and a thin column of smoke rose from the chimney. It's lovely, Deanna said with genuine admiration. It's home, Vaughn replied simply, unable to hide the pride in his voice. As they approached, a stout woman in her 50s emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the sun. Behind her, Henry and two other ranch hands appeared from the barn, clearly surprised to see their boss returning with a woman in his arms. Vaughn Lockhart, what have you done now? The woman called out as they drew closer. Found a schoolteacher half dead in the South Line shack, Mrs. Finch, Vaughn called back. Think you can nurse her back to health? Mrs. Finch's expression shifted from suspicion to concern. Of course I can. Bring her right in, and I'll have the boys fetch the doctor from town. As they dismounted, or rather, as Vaughn lifted Deanna down and carried her toward the house despite her weak protests that she could walk, Henry took the reins of both horses. Found more than you bargained for on your rounds, eh, boss? The older man said with a knowing look that Vaughn chose to ignore. Miss Wilson's wagon broke down about 5 miles east of the South Line shack, he explained instead. Near the dry creek with the cottonwoods. Can you and the boys retrieve it once you've seen to the horses? Henry nodded. Consider it done. And the doctor? Yes, send for him, but tell him it's not an emergency anymore. Her fever broke, but she's still weak. Inside the house, Mrs. Finch had already turned down the bed in the spare room and was heating water for a bath. The housekeeper took one look at Deanna's exhausted state and shooed Vaughn out of the room. Out with you now. The poor girl needs a proper wash and some female attention. Go make yourself useful elsewhere. Vaughn retreated, oddly reluctant to leave Deanna's side after their journey together. At the door, he paused. You're in good hands with Mrs. Finch, Miss Wilson. She's the closest thing to a doctor we have out here until the real one arrives. Deanna smiled weakly from where Mrs. Finch had settled her in a chair. Thank you, Mr. Lockhart, for everything. He nodded, suddenly awkward. Just doing what anyone would do. No, she said softly. Not anyone. With those words lingering in his mind, Vaughn left to help his men, trying to ignore the strange feeling that his life had somehow shifted on its axis in the span of a single-day doctor. James Patterson arrived the following morning, his buggy clattering into the ranch yard just after sunrise. Vaughn, who had slept poorly despite his exhaustion, was already up and splitting firewood when the doctor arrived. Heard you found yourself a patient, Lockhart, the doctor called as he climbed down from his buggy, medical bag in hand. Vaughn set down his axe and wiped the sweat from his brow. Son's sickness and exhaustion, mostly. Her fever broke night before last, but she's still weak. The doctor nodded. Henry gave me the basics. Let's have a look at her, shall we? Inside, Mrs. Finch had already prepared breakfast and helped Deanna into one of her own clean nightgowns. The schoolteacher was sitting up in bed, some color returned to her cheeks, though dark circles remained beneath her eyes. Vaughn hovered in the doorway as Dr. Patterson examined her, only stepping back when Mrs. Finch shooed him away again. For goodness sake, Vaughn, give the poor girl some privacy. Go eat your breakfast. In the kitchen, he found himself unable to focus on food, instead straining to hear the doctor's assessment from the other room. When Dr. Patterson finally emerged, Vaughn was on his feet immediately. How is she? The doctor gave him an appraising look. She'll be fine with rest and proper care. The fever's gone, but she's depleted. Needs at least a week of good food and minimal exertion before she even thinks about traveling to Copper Creek. A week, Vaughn tried to hide his relief at the news that she would be staying longer. I can send word to the town council. They'll understand. Already planned to stop there on my way back, the doctor assured him. Now she needs plenty of fluids, nutritious food, and rest. Nothing strenuous for at least 3 days. After that, short walks to build her strength. Vaughn nodded, committing the instructions to memory. Anything else? Yes, the doctor said with a sudden smile. You might try not looking quite so concerned. You'll scare the poor girl into thinking she's worse off than she is. Embarrassed, Vaughn straightened his expression. Just being neighborly, Doc. Of course you are, the doctor replied with a knowing look that reminded Vaughn uncomfortably of Henry's expression the previous day. I'll check back in a few days. Send for me sooner if there's any change. After the doctor left, Vaughn approached Deanna's room cautiously, knocking softly on the half-open door. She was sitting up against the pillows, a quilt tucked around her legs despite the warmth of the day. Doctor says you're to stay put for a few days, he informed her. I'll send word to Copper Creek about the delay. Deanna looked troubled. I hate to inconvenience you further, Mr. Lockhart, and I'm sure the town is anxiously awaiting their teacher. The children won't start forgetting their letters if you're a week late, he assured her with a smile. And it's no inconvenience. The spare room doesn't get nearly enough use. She studied him for a moment, her blue eyes thoughtful. Why are you doing all this for a stranger? The question caught him off guard. Like I said before out here, yes, I know, helping others is survival. She shook her head slightly. But this goes beyond that. You could have simply taken me to the nearest town or sent for someone else to care for me. Vaughn shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. Mrs. Finch would have my hide if I tried to pawn you off on someone else after finding you half dead on my property. This earned him a small smile. Mrs. Finch does seem formidable. You have no idea, he agreed, grateful for the change in subject. She's been with me since I bought this place. Came with her husband originally, but he passed 2 winters ago. Pneumonia. I'm sorry to hear that. He was a good man, taught me a lot about ranching, same as Henry. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only when Mrs. Finch appeared with a tray bearing broth and bread. Enough chatter, the housekeeper declared. Miss Wilson needs to eat and rest, and you, Vaughn Lockhart, have a ranch to run. He raised his hands in surrender. Yes, madam, I know when I'm outranked. As he turned to leave, Deanna called after him softly. Mr. Lockhart, thank you again. Something in her voice made him pause and look back. You're welcome, Miss Wilson. For the next 3 days, Vaughn found himself inventing reasons to check on Deanna throughout the day. He brought her books from his small library, sat with her during meals once she was strong enough to join them at the table, and found himself sharing stories of his early days in the territory that he had never told anyone else. In turn, she told him about her life in Boston, her passion for teaching, and her decision to come west despite her family's objections. My mother cried for days when I told them, she confessed, as they sat on the porch on the evening of her 3rd day at the ranch. The doctor had approved short periods outside, and Vaughn had carried a comfortable chair out for her. My father threatened to cut me off without a penny. Did he follow through? Vaughn asked, curious about the steel he sensed beneath her refined exterior. Deanna nodded. He did. Said if I was determined to throw my life away in the wilderness, I could do it without his financial support. That must have been difficult. It was. I had some savings of my own, and my grandmother left me a small inheritance that my father couldn't touch. It was enough to get me here, but... She hesitated. But what? But I have very little margin for error now. The wagon breaking down was not part of my careful calculations. She smiled ruefully. Neither was nearly dying of fever in a lined shack. Vaughn considered this. The council in Copper Creek is providing housing for you at least. Yes, a small cottage behind the schoolhouse, and the salary is adequate if modest. You're braver than most men I know, he said with genuine admiration. Coming all this way alone, starting fresh with nothing but your wits and determination. She looked surprised at the compliment. I don't feel particularly brave, just stubborn, perhaps. Sometimes they're the same thing, he replied with a smile. On the 4th day, Henry and the ranch hands returned with Deanna's repaired wagon and the rest of her belongings. Vaughn helped her sort through them, relieved to find that while some items had been damaged by exposure, most of her teaching materials and personal effects were intact. "My mother's locket," she exclaimed with joy when she discovered the small silver pendant nestled in a handkerchief. "I was afraid it had been lost." She opened it to reveal a miniature portrait of an elegant woman with Deanna's same blue eyes. "She gave it to me the morning I left after my father had stormed out of the house. Said that even though she didn't understand my decision, she respected my courage." Vaughn found himself touched by the story. His own parting from family had been far less amicable, with harsh words on both sides that had never been mended. "You're lucky to have her support, even from a distance," he said quietly. Deanna looked up at him, sensing the story behind his words. "And your family, do they ever write to you?" "My mother does, occasionally. My father made it clear I wasn't to return unless I was prepared to admit I was wrong and take my place in the bank." "And you're still not ready to do that," she observed. Vaughn gestured around them. "This is my life now. I've built something here that matters to me. I'm not giving it up to sit behind a desk counting other men's money." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It's a good life from what I've seen. You should be proud." As the days passed and Deanna's strength returned, Vaughn found himself increasingly drawn to her company. She was unlike any woman he had met in the territory, educated and refined, yes, but also resilient and curious about everything around her. She asked endless questions about ranching, soaking up information with an enthusiasm that both amused and impressed him. By the end of the week, she was taking longer walks around the ranch, often accompanied by Vaughn when he could spare the time from his duties. He showed her his favorite spots: the creek where the water ran clear over smooth stones, the ridge that offered a view all the way to the distant mountains, the grove of trees where he sometimes went to think when decisions weighed heavily on him. On one such walk, they stopped to rest beneath an old oak tree, its massive branches providing welcome shade from the afternoon sun. Deanna had regained much of her strength, though she still tired more easily than she would have liked. "The doctor says I can travel to Copper Creek in 2 more days," she said as they sat side by side on a fallen log. Vaughn felt an unexpected tightness in his chest at her words. "That soon? It's already been more than a week. The town has been very patient, but they need their teacher." She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "And I've imposed on your hospitality far too long." "You haven't imposed," he said quickly. "Having you here has been nice." The inadequacy of the word frustrated him, but he couldn't find a better one that wouldn't reveal too much of what he was beginning to feel. Deanna glanced up at him, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "It has been nice, hasn't it, despite the inauspicious beginning?" "I don't know," Vaughn said with a teasing smile. "Finding a beautiful woman half dead in my line shack wasn't the worst way to start a day." As soon as the words left his mouth, he regretted them. He hadn't meant to call her beautiful so openly, though he had certainly thought it often enough over the past days. To his relief, Deanna laughed softly. "I'm sure I was a sight to behold, dirty and delirious as I was." "You were still the prettiest thing I'd seen in months," he admitted, deciding honesty was the best course now. Her blush deepened. "Mr. Lockhart, I'm beginning to think you're flirting with me." "Vaughn," he corrected. "After all we've been through, I think you can use my first name." "Vaughn," she repeated, the sound of his name on her lips sending a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. "Then you must call me Deanna." "Deanna," he said, testing it out. "It suits you." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. Finally, Vaughn spoke again, choosing his words carefully. "Copper Creek isn't that far from here, about half a day's ride." She looked at him questioningly. "Yes. What I mean is, once you're settled there, perhaps I could come visit sometime. Check on how you're adapting to life as a frontier schoolmarm." He tried to keep his tone light, though his heart was suddenly pounding faster than it had any right to. Deanna's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I would like that very much, Vaughn. 2 days later, Vaughn hitched Deanna's repaired wagon to her rested mare, now healthy and strong again after proper care and feeding. Mrs. Finch had packed a basket of food for the journey and, to Deanna's embarrassment and gratitude, had altered one of her own dresses to fit her, as Deanna's Eastern clothes were wholly unsuitable for the climate. "It's nothing fancy," the housekeeper said as she smoothed the simple brown cotton dress. "But it'll serve you better than those frilly things you brought from Boston. It's perfect, Mrs. Finch. I can't thank you enough for all your kindness." The older woman waved away her thanks. "Just you take care of yourself in Copper Creek, and don't be a stranger to the Double L. The place could use a woman's touch now and then." Henry and the other ranch hands came to see her off, each awkwardly tipping their hats and mumbling good wishes. They had grown fond of the Eastern schoolteacher who had shown such interest in their work and treated them with genuine respect. When it was time to depart, Vaughn insisted on driving her to Copper Creek himself. "No arguments," he said when she began to protest. "The doctor said you're still not at full strength, and besides, I need to speak with Sheriff Mills anyway." The journey to Copper Creek was filled with conversation that flowed as easily as it had during their walks around the ranch. Deanna pointed out plants she now recognized thanks to Vaughn's teachings, and he shared stories about the area they passed through. As they approached the town, a collection of wooden buildings lining a single wide street, with a white church steeple rising prominently at one end, Deanna fell silent, suddenly nervous about the new life awaiting her. Vaughn seemed to sense her anxiety. "They'll love you," he assured her. "And if they don't, they'll have me to answer to." This made her laugh, easing the tension in her shoulders. "My very own cowboy protector, something like that," he replied, his eyes on the road ahead. The town council had gathered at the schoolhouse to meet her, along with several curious townspeople. Vaughn helped Deanna down from the wagon, conscious of the many eyes watching them. Mayor Thompson, a portly man with an impressive mustache, stepped forward to greet them. "Miss Wilson, we had almost given up hope of your arrival. Welcome to Copper Creek." Deanna straightened her shoulders, suddenly every inch the proper Boston schoolteacher despite her borrowed dress. "Thank you, Mayor Thompson. I apologize for the delay. I had some unexpected difficulties on the journey." "So we heard from Dr. Patterson," the mayor replied, his eyes flicking curiously to Vaughn. "Mr. Lockhart didn't expect to see you in town today." Vaughn nodded politely. "Mayor, just ensuring Miss Wilson arrived safely." A woman stepped forward from the crowd, her friendly face creased with smile lines. "I'm Martha Jenkins, Miss Wilson. I've been looking after the school until your arrival. The children are so excited to meet their new teacher." Deanna's face lit up. "I can't wait to meet them as well." "When do classes begin?" "Monday morning," Martha replied. "That gives you 3 days to settle in and prepare." The small cottage behind the schoolhouse was simple but clean, with basic furnishings and a small garden plot that had been recently weeded in preparation for her arrival. As the council members and curious onlookers helped bring in Deanna's belongings, Vaughn found himself standing awkwardly to one side, suddenly unsure of his place in her new life. When the last of her trunks had been carried in and the townspeople began to disperse, promising to return with welcoming gifts of food and household items, Deanna approached him where he waited beside the wagon. "Thank you for seeing me safely here," she said, her voice formal in the presence of observers. Though her eyes conveyed warmer emotions, Vaughn nodded, equally conscious of the watching eyes. "It was my pleasure, Miss Wilson. If you need anything, send word to the Double L. I will." She hesitated, then asked softly, "You'll come visit, as you promised?" The hope in her voice bolstered his courage. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." This drew a smile from her. "Good, perhaps in 2 weeks, once I've had time to establish myself with the children." 2 weeks, he agreed. "I'll bring Mrs. Finch's apple pie." With that promise between them, Vaughn climbed back onto the wagon seat and turned the horses toward home, already counting the days until he could see her again. The 2 weeks that followed were among the longest of Vaughn's life. He threw himself into ranch work, making improvements he had been putting off for months and driving his men hard enough that Henry finally confronted him. You're wearing yourself out, boss, the foreman said one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, and the rest of us along with you. This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain schoolteacher, would it? Vaughn scowled at his friend. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't, Henry replied with a knowing chuckle. That's why you've been looking down the road toward Copper Creek every 5 minutes for the past 2 weeks. I have not, Vaughn protested, though he knew it was at least partially true. I've just been thinking it's time we expanded the north pasture, and I need to go to town for supplies anyway. Uh-huh, Henry wasn't fooled. Well, when you go to town for those supplies, give Miss Wilson my regards. Vaughn gave up the pretense with a sigh. Is it that obvious? Only to anyone with eyes, the foreman replied dryly. You haven't shown this much interest in a woman since. Well, ever as far as I can recall. She's different, Vaughn admitted. Smart, brave, doesn't complain about hardships that would send most Eastern women running back home. And pretty as a sunset, Henry added with a grin. There's that too, Vaughn conceded, unable to stop the smile that spread across his face. On the appointed day, Vaughn rose before dawn, spending more time than usual on his appearance. He trimmed his beard neatly, donned his newest shirt, and even polished his boots, actions that earned him more knowing looks from Mrs. Finch and the ranch hands. It's just a friendly visit, he insisted as Mrs. Finch handed him the promised apple pie, carefully wrapped for the journey. Of course it is, dear, she replied, patting his arm, and I'm the Queen of England. The ride to Copper Creek seemed shorter this time, his anticipation making the miles fly by. As he approached the town, he saw children playing in the schoolyard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Classes must have just ended for the day. Deanna stood on the schoolhouse steps, watching the children with a smile that transformed her face. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair neatly pinned back but with a few strands escaping around her face in the light wind. She looked, Vaughn thought, like she belonged there, as if she had been part of this landscape forever instead of just a few short weeks. When she spotted him riding toward the schoolhouse, her smile widened and she lifted a hand in greeting. The simple gesture made his heart leap in his chest like a green colt. Mr. Lockhart, she called as he dismounted. What a pleasant surprise. Her formal address reminded him that they were in public, with several parents still collecting their children and casting curious glances their way. Miss Wilson, he replied with equal formality, tipping his hat. I was in town on business and thought I'd check on how you're settling in. Very well, thank you. Her eyes sparkled with suppressed laughter at their stilted exchange. Would you care to come in for some tea? I've just dismissed the children for the day. That would be most kind, he said, following her into the schoolhouse. Inside, away from prying eyes, her formality melted away. I've been counting the days, she admitted as she put a kettle on the small stove at the back of the room. So have I, Vaughn confessed, setting the pie on her desk. Mrs. Finch sends her regards and this. Deanna's face lit up. Her apple pie, how wonderful. Please thank her for me. As she prepared the tea, Vaughn looked around the schoolroom with interest. It was a single large room with rows of simple desks facing a larger teacher's desk at the front. Slates hung on one wall, covered with writing exercises in various stages of completion. A bookshelf held a small but carefully selected library. How many students do you have? He asked. 23, ranging from 6 to 16 years old, she replied, setting 2 cups of tea on her desk and gesturing for him to take the chair opposite hers. It's a challenge teaching so many different levels at once, but they're eager learners. The pride in her voice was unmistakable. You love it already, he observed. I do. She sipped her tea thoughtfully. It's different from what I expected, but in good ways. The children are more genuine, I suppose, less constrained by social expectations than those I taught in Boston. And the town, they're treating you well. Deanna nodded. Everyone has been very welcoming. Mrs. Jenkins has practically adopted me, bringing me home cooked meals and introducing me to everyone. And the Reverend and his wife had me to dinner last Sunday. I'm glad, Vaughn said, genuinely relieved to hear she was being accepted by the community. I was worried they might hold your delayed arrival against you, she laughed. Quite the opposite. My adventure, as they're calling it, has made me something of a local celebrity. I've been asked to recount the story at least a dozen times, including the part where a rugged rancher rescued you, he teased. Especially that part, she replied with a smile. Though I may have embellished your heroism slightly, only slightly, I'm wounded. Their easy banter continued as they shared the pie and she told him about her first 2 weeks of teaching. The afternoon slipped away, and before Vaughn knew it, shadows were lengthening across the schoolroom floor. I should get back, he said reluctantly. It's a long ride and I don't want to arrive after dark. Deanna walked with him to where his horse was tethered outside. Thank you for coming, Vaughn. It means more than I can say. The sound of his name on her lips, spoken softly now that they were alone, made his heart skip. I'll come again if that's all right, maybe in another week or two. I'd like that very much. She hesitated, then added, or perhaps I could visit the Double L sometime, when school is not in session, of course. The thought of showing her more of his ranch, of sharing that part of his life with her, filled him with unexpected joy. Anytime. Mrs. Finch would be delighted, and so would I. As he mounted his horse, Deanna impulsively reached up to touch his hand where it rested on the saddle horn. Be safe on the ride home. The simple touch, warm and gentle, stayed with him all the way back to the ranch. True to his word, Vaughn visited Copper Creek again 2 weeks later, this time bringing a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. The pattern continued through the autumn months, Vaughn riding to town every other week, Deanna occasionally making the journey to the Double L on Saturdays when she had no school responsibilities. With each visit, they grew closer. Vaughn found himself sharing thoughts and dreams he had never voiced to anyone else, and Deanna spoke openly of her hopes for her students and her growing love for the western landscape she had once found so alien. As winter approached, bringing colder weather and shorter days, their visits became more precious but also more challenging to arrange. The first snow fell in early December, making the roads between the ranch and Copper Creek treacherous. You shouldn't have come, Deanna scolded when Vaughn arrived at her cottage one Saturday afternoon, his coat covered in melting snow. The weather is turning worse by the hour. I promised, he said simply, stomping his boots clean on her doorstep. She ushered him inside, where a fire burned cheerfully in the small hearth. You could have been caught in a blizzard. Worth the risk, he replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. That evening, as they sat before the fire drinking hot cider, Vaughn made a decision he had been contemplating for weeks. Deanna, he began, his voice unusually serious, there's something I need to tell you. She set down her mug, concern crossing her face. What is it? These past months, getting to know you, they've been the happiest of my life. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. I find myself thinking about you all the time when I'm working with the cattle, when I'm eating dinner, when I'm falling asleep at night. I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore. Deanna's eyes widened, a blush spreading across her cheeks. Vaughn, I know it might be too soon, he continued quickly. You've only been here a few months and you're still building your life in Copper Creek. But I need you to know how I feel. I'm in love with you, Deanna Wilson. The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Vaughn held his breath, watching her face for any sign of her reaction. For a long moment, Deanna said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, a smile spread across her face, radiant as the sunrise. Oh, Vaughn, she whispered. I've been falling in love with you since the day you sat beside me in that lined shack and prayed for my fever to break. I just wasn't sure if you felt the same way. Relief and joy flooded through him. Without thinking, he reached for her hands, holding them gently in his own. I do, more than I can say. What does this mean? She asked softly. For us. Vaughn thought about the distance between the ranch and the town, about her teaching responsibilities and his commitment to the Double L. I don't know exactly, he admitted, but we'll figure it out together if you're willing. I am, she said without hesitation, very willing. Outside, the snow fell more heavily, but neither of them noticed as Vaughn leaned forward and, with infinite tenderness, kissed her for the first time. The kiss was everything Deanna had dreamed. It might be gentle yet passionate, a promise of deeper feelings that had been growing between them for months. When they finally parted, she felt as though her whole world had shifted, rearranging itself around this new reality where Vaughn Lockhart loved her and she loved him in return. "I should go," he murmured, though he made no move to release her hands, "before the snow gets worse." "You can't go in this weather," she protested, looking toward the window where fat snowflakes swirled in the darkening sky. "It's too dangerous." "What would the good people of Copper Creek say if I stayed?" he asked, only half joking. He had no wish to damage her reputation in the small community where such things mattered deeply. Deanna considered this practical concern. "Mrs. Jenkins lives just across the street. I could ask her to come stay as a chaperone just for appearance's sake." Vaughn smiled at her quick solution. A wise compromise. Mrs. Jenkins, a widow in her 60s who had taken Deanna under her wing from the start, was happy to oblige, bringing her knitting and settling herself comfortably in Deanna's small parlor while Vaughn took the room's only other chair. The arrangement was proper enough to satisfy propriety, yet still allowed them to talk late into the evening, with Mrs. Jenkins providing occasional commentary or stories of her own. By morning, the snow had stopped, though it lay thick on the ground. Vaughn departed reluctantly with a promise to return as soon as the weather permitted. "Be careful," Deanna urged as she stood at her door, watching him mount his horse. "Always," he replied, his eyes conveying so much more than the simple word. The winter months passed with fewer visits than either would have liked, as storms frequently made travel between the ranch and town impossible. They exchanged letters when they couldn't see each other, carried by whoever happened to be making the journey between the two places. In these letters, they shared their daily lives in greater detail than they had during their visits. Vaughn wrote about his struggles with a particularly harsh winter that threatened his cattle, while Deanna described her triumphs and challenges with her students. "My dearest Deanna," one letter began, "the north pasture is finally clear of snow, and the cattle are finding good grazing there. We lost fewer than I feared to the cold, just 7 head, which is a miracle considering how brutal January was. Henry says it's because I was too stubborn to let them die, but I think it's because I had something important to live for this winter. Someone to come back to after long days of breaking ice and hauling feed. The thought of your smile kept me warm on the coldest nights." And her reply, "My beloved Vaughn, the children presented me with a quilt yesterday, each square sewn by a different family in town. Mrs. Jenkins organized it all in secret. I wept when they gave it to me, partly from surprise, but mostly because I realized Copper Creek has become home in a way I never expected. Boston seems like a distant memory now. Yet as much as I love this town and my students, my heart is often with you at the Double L. I count the days until spring makes the roads passable again." When spring finally arrived, bringing with it muddy roads but easier travel, their reunions were all the sweeter for the separation they had endured. Deanna visited the ranch one warm Saturday in April, and Vaughn took her riding across land now lush with new growth. They stopped at a high meadow carpeted with wildflowers, dismounting to let the horses graze while they spread a blanket beneath a lone oak tree. Mrs. Finch had packed a picnic basket for them, filled with cold chicken, fresh bread, and early strawberries from her garden. As they ate, Vaughn seemed preoccupied, his usual easy conversation replaced by thoughtful silence. "What are you thinking about so intently?" Deanna finally asked, touching his hand to draw his attention back to her. He smiled, though there was a nervousness to it she hadn't seen before. "I've been thinking about the future." "What about it?" Vaughn took a deep breath. "Deanna, these past months have been the happiest of my life. Even with the distance between us, even with the winter keeping us apart more than I would have liked, I've never been more certain of anything than I am of my love for you." Her heart began to race as she sensed where this conversation was heading. "I feel the same way. I know your teaching means everything to you, and Copper Creek has become your home. I would never ask you to give that up." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that looked incongruous against his calloused hand. But I'm hoping you might consider making the double L your home too as my wife. Opening the box, he revealed a simple but beautiful ring with a small diamond that caught the spring sunlight. It was my grandmother's. My mother sent it when I wrote to her about you. Tears filled Deanna's eyes, not of sadness but overwhelming joy. Oh, Vaughn, I know it's not as grand as something you might have had in Boston. It's perfect, she interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. Absolutely perfect. Then will you marry me? Yes, she said without hesitation. With all my heart, yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit as if it had been made for her, Deanna felt as though her life had come full circle. The journey that had begun with fever and desperation in a lined shack had led her to this moment of perfect happiness beneath an oak tree in a wildflower meadow. Vaughn pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that spoke of their shared future and all the joy it promised. When they finally separated, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I was thinking, he said, his voice husky, that we could build a new house halfway between the ranch and Copper Creek, close enough for you to continue teaching but also part of the double L. The thoughtfulness of his suggestion, his willingness to compromise rather than expect her to give up her newfound purpose, only confirmed what she already knew, that this was the man she was meant to spend her life with. That sounds wonderful, she agreed. But I would be happy anywhere as long as we're together. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning their future, imagining the house they would build, the life they would create together. By the time they rode back to the ranch, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land that had brought them together. Mrs. Finch, spotting the ring on Deanna's finger as soon as they entered the house, let out a cry of delight and rushed to embrace them both. Henry and the other ranch hands, hearing the commotion, came in from the bunkhouse to offer their congratulations. About time, boss, Henry said with a grin, slapping Vaughn on the back. We were starting to wonder if you'd ever work up the courage. Amid the celebrations and teasing, Deanna caught Vaughn's eye across the room, and in that glance was a world of understanding and promise. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Copper Creek, with most of the town expressing delight at their schoolteacher's happiness. A few eyebrows were raised at the idea of a married woman continuing to teach, but Mayor Thompson, who had come to respect Deanna's dedication to her students, assured her that her position was secure for as long as she wished to hold it. They set the wedding date for August, when the school term would be finished and before the fall cattle drive would demand Vaughn's full attention. Mrs. Jenkins and several other ladies from town immediately began planning the celebration, while Mrs. Finch took charge of the wedding feast. As the day approached, Deanna received a letter from her parents, the first since she had left Boston nearly a year before. Dearest daughter, her mother wrote, your father and I have received your letter announcing your engagement to Mr. Lockhart. While we still believe you made a hasty decision in leaving Boston, we cannot deny that you sound happier than we have ever known you to be. Your descriptions of your school and your future husband speak of a life filled with purpose and love, which is all we have ever truly wanted for you. Your father, though he will never admit it, was impressed by Mr. Lockhart's letter requesting his blessing for your marriage. He says any man who would write so eloquently and respectfully, despite never having met us, must have some redeeming qualities. We have discussed the matter at length, and if you will have us, would very much like to attend your wedding. Boston seems emptier without your spirit brightening our home, and we find ourselves curious about the life you have built so far from us. With love always, your mother. Tears streamed down Deanna's face as she read and reread the letter. When she showed it to Vaughn that evening, he held her close as she cried tears of relief and happiness. I never thought they would come, she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. I thought my father would never forgive me for leaving. Vaughn stroked her hair gently. Parents can surprise you sometimes. Mine did when my mother sent the ring and her blessing. You never told me you wrote to my father, she said, looking up at him with wonder. He shrugged, a little embarrassed. Seemed like the proper thing to do, even if he might toss my letter in the fire without reading it. I wanted him to know that I would cherish and protect his daughter, even if I wasn't the son-in-law he had envisioned. "I love you, Vaughn Lockhart," Deanna said, her heart so full it felt it might burst. More than I ever thought possible, the day of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, with a sky so blue it seemed to go on forever. Deanna stood in Mrs. Jenkins' spare bedroom, where she had spent the night in accordance with tradition. While her mother helped her dress in the gown they had created together over the past week. It was simpler than what she might have worn in Boston, made of cream-colored satin with lace at the collar and cuffs, but it suited her new life perfectly. Her mother had brought the veil from home, the same one she had worn at her own wedding 30 years before. "You look beautiful, my dear," Mrs. Wilson said, tears glistening in her eyes as she adjusted the veil. "So grown up and radiant, that's the word. You're positively glowing with happiness." "I am happy, Mother, happier than I ever dreamed possible." "Your Mr. Lockhart is a fine man," her mother admitted. "Your father and I were impressed when we met him yesterday, not at all what we expected." Deanna smiled, remembering the dinner where her parents had finally met Vaughn. Her father, initially stiff and formal, had gradually warmed to the rancher as they discussed cattle markets and the economics of the territory. By the end of the evening, they had been sharing glasses of whiskey and stories like old friends. "He's everything I could want," Deanna said softly. "Strong but gentle, determined but kind, and he loves me for who I am, not who he thinks I should be." Her mother squeezed her hand. "That's all any mother wants for her daughter. I'm sorry it took us so long to see that you had found it here." A knock at the door interrupted their moment. Mrs. Jenkins peeked in, her face flushed with excitement. "It's time, dear. Everyone's waiting at the church." The small white church was filled to capacity, with Deanna's students and their families, ranch hands from the Double L, and what seemed like every resident of Copper Creek crowded into the pews. Vaughn stood at the altar beside the reverend, looking so handsome in his new suit that Deanna's breath caught when she first saw him. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, their eyes met and held, and in that moment, the church and the assembled guests seemed to fade away until there was only the two of them, reaching across the space that separated them with their gaze. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. When they exchanged vows, Vaughn's voice was steady and sure, while Deanna's trembled slightly with emotion. The ring he placed on her finger to join her engagement band was a plain gold circle that matched the one she placed on his hand. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the reverend declared with evident pleasure. "Mr. Lockhart, you may kiss your bride." Vaughn lifted her veil gently, his eyes never leaving hers as he leaned down to seal their union with a kiss that was at once tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with dancing and feasting under the stars. Deanna's father surprised everyone, including his wife, by playing the fiddle for several dances, while Mrs. Finch's wedding feast drew praise from even the most discerning palates. As the night wore on, Deanna found a moment to slip away from the festivities, needing a breath of quiet amidst the joyful chaos. She stood at the edge of the churchyard, looking up at the vast canopy of stars that seemed to blanket the Texas sky. She sensed rather than heard Vaughn approach, his presence as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his solid strength. "Happy Mrs. Lockhart," he murmured against her ear. The new name sent a thrill through her. "Completely, Mr. Lockhart, and you," more than I ever thought possible. He turned her in his arms to face him. "I keep thinking about that day I found you in the line shack, burning with fever. How close I came to losing you before I ever really knew you." "But you didn't lose me," she reminded him. "You sat beside me and prayed, remember, and here we are." "Here we are," he agreed, pulling her closer. "And here we'll stay, building our life together day by day." As Vaughn lowered his head to kiss her again beneath the vast Texas sky, Deanna knew with absolute certainty that the fever that had nearly taken her life had instead led her to a love more profound than she had ever imagined possible, a love born in desperation. but destined to last a lifetime. 5 years later, Deanna sat on the porch of their home, the house Vaughn had built for them exactly halfway between Copper Creek and the Double L Ranch. She watched as her husband taught their 3-year-old son, Samuel, how to gently brush a pony Vaughn had raised specifically for the boy. "Like this, Papa?" Samuel asked, his small face serious with concentration as he mimicked his father's movements. "That's right, son," Vaughn replied, his voice filled with pride. "Nice and easy so you don't startle him." Inside the house, their 1-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, napped under the watchful eye of Mrs. Finch, who had moved from the main ranch house to live with them after Vaughn's foreman Henry had finally persuaded her to marry him 3 years earlier. Deanna's hand rested on her rounded belly, where their third child grew. Life had blessed them abundantly in the years since their wedding, with a growing family, a prosperous ranch, and deep roots in the community they both loved. She still taught at the schoolhouse in Copper Creek 3 days a week, having trained an assistant to handle the other 2 days. The arrangement allowed her to balance her passion for teaching with her role as a mother and partner in the ranch's operations. Vaughn had expanded the Double L considerably, his careful management and forward-thinking approaches making it one of the most respected ranching operations in the county. He had recently been elected to the town council, where his fair-mindedness and practical wisdom made him a valued voice in community decisions. As Deanna watched her husband and son, her heart swelled with the same love that had grown steadily stronger with each passing year. The memory of that desperate day in the line shack had faded to a story they told occasionally, the unlikely beginning of their journey together. Vaughn looked up, catching her gaze across the yard, and the smile that spread across his face still made her breath catch. He whispered something to Samuel, who nodded enthusiastically, and then they both started toward the porch. "Mama," Samuel called, running ahead of his father, "Papa says it's time for my story. Will you tell the one about how you and Papa met?" Deanna laughed, opening her arms to her son as he clambered onto the porch. "Again, you've heard that story 100 times. But it's my favorite," the boy insisted, settling himself on her lap carefully, mindful of her pregnant belly as Vaughn had taught him to be. Vaughn sat down beside them, his arm slipping around Deanna's shoulders as naturally as breathing. "It's my favorite too," he admitted with a wink. "Well then," Deanna began, snuggling her son closer as her husband's thumb traced gentle circles on her shoulder. "It happened on the hottest day of summer when I was lost and alone and very, very sick." As she recounted their beginning once more for their son's eager ears, Deanna exchanged a look of deep understanding with Vaughn. What had started as a desperate prayer beside a fever-stricken stranger had blossomed into a love story more beautiful than either of them could have imagined, a story that continued to unfold with each passing day, each new challenge, each shared joy. And in the quiet moments like this, with their children and their home and the land they both loved surrounding them, they found the truest answer to that long-ago prayer, a life built on love, faith, and the courage to follow their hearts across the wild frontier of possibility.